Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com. How to make an easy carved wood sea turtle. Now these sea turtles, or this sea turtle, was designed to be either wall or fence hung. It's a pretty easy sculpture, and it's actually made out of a couple of scrap pieces of 2x12 pressure treated. The main tool for the job is just a disc grinder with a flap sanding wheel. Also used a dremel grinder to add some of the details, but it's a pretty easy project. Now we're going to start out with 3 sections of 2x12 that are cut to 2 or 3 feet long. I'm going to start with the shell, and I cut out the basic shape of the shell with a jigsaw. And you can see that the width of that shell is kind of predetermined by the width of the 2x12. So all I'm basically doing is curving it and then using this flap sanding wheel on a disc grinder or angle grinder. And this is a pretty aggressive sanding wheel. This is a 36 grit. Kind of rips through the material very quickly. I'm just smoothing it all around. I'm leaving the line in the middle, the highest on the shell. And I'm just rounding out all of the edges, and I'm tapering the edges on both sides, almost down until they meet the bottom edge of that board. So this process does take a little bit of time, but it's not hard. It's not difficult at all. It's just, just have to spend a little bit of time at it. Just go back and forth. You try to round over all of the edges as best you can. And then I flipped it over and I basically rounded out or carved out a little groove for the head as well, or for the neck, as well as each one of the fins, to make it look like the head and the neck and the fins are actually going to protrude out of a shell. The next step, I took 2 pieces of that 2x12 and I glued them together with wood glue. I put a couple clamps on them and let them dry overnight. And then I'm just going to sketch the entire design of the sea turtle with that shell basically determining the size. And I just really did this what I thought by eye looked good. I'm then going to use a jigsaw to cut out that outline. So now I've got the outline of the sea turtle cut out on the bottom 2 pieces, which are glued together, and I've got a separate shell which is going to be glued in place towards the end of the project. I decided I wanted the head to protrude a little bit higher than that base piece, so I just glued an extra piece of 1x pine onto the head, and then I'm just going to use that same disc grinder to kind of bring all of the edges even, and then start to carve out the shape of the head or shape of the face. And really all I've done here was rounded out all of the sides, smoothed out all of those edges, and I cut a small groove, or I sanded a small groove for the mouth. Now I'm going to start to work on the fins. It doesn't matter if you start on the back fins or the front fins. You want to taper the edges. The inside of the fin, the part that's the flapper, should get pretty thin, and you just round over the outer edge. What I did, because this is going to be a wall hanging sculpture, is I rounded the tip of the back fins downward, and then later on I'll hollow out the back just to give it some a little bit of a 3-dimensional look. On the front flippers, I'm going to make the inside of those as thin as possible. You don't want them so thin that they're going to break, but you really want them to be visually thinner than the outside edge of those front flippers. So the inside I'm going to really taper down, and the outside I'm just going to round over. I'm just rounding over that outside edge. And again, none of this is very difficult, just a little bit time consuming. And once you get used to that disc grinder, especially with the coarse grit flap sanding wheel, it really does go pretty quickly. So now I flipped over the sea turtle, and I'm just kind of hollowing out those back flippers the middle of them. So, you know, on the top surface, I've carved down the bottom tip, and on the inside, I've kind of carved out the middle, and it's just giving the impression that that fin is kind of tapered downward. I did use an oscillating sander to kind of smooth out some of the rough edges created from the disc grinder. I just used a number 80 grit sanding disc on this oscillating sander, and that did a pretty quick job smoothing out, rounding over all of the edges. The next step in the process is going to be to add some detail lines. So I'm adding lines onto each one of the flippers, basically just inward from that outer edge, straight lines, and then you almost make like a house-shaped roof on them. And then I'm going to actually cut these grooves with a dremel grinder with a cutoff wheel. And this very quickly and easily carves you know, a decently deep slot on each one of those pencil-marked lines. It's these details that are really going to make the finished product you know, really stand out a little bit. You can see how fast cutting these lines goes. I do all of the same angle at the same time, and then I just go back and forth until it's all done. You can use that same cutoff wheel to create irregular lines also. Instead, it doesn't have to be used just to cut straight lines. So I did add a couple of irregular lines on the inner side of that flipper, the side that is also the thinnest, because there's different textures on the flipper of a sea turtle. So now it's time to just draw the detail on the shell, and I'm just I basically looked online. I found a sea turtle, and they all have, you know, basically the same type of lines on their shell. I'm drawing just a six-sided figure. I used kind of a curved edge to each one of them, and I drew it in with pencil. The first time I drew it, it just didn't look good, and I basically just sanded it off and started again. And I tried it a couple times until it visually looked satisfactory to me. And then from those, just outward lines, and then back to that Dremel grinder, same cutoff wheel. And you see how I'm just pivoting that tool because there is a slight curve to each one of those lines. And this really doesn't take long at all. You just basically just putting a line or carving a line at each one of those pencil marks. What I also did with the shell is I did go over it with a finer sandpaper. I think it was a 220 grit that I put in the oscillating sander, so that the shell is actually smoother than the rest of the sculpture. Just going to add some additional lines to the outer band of the sea turtle's shell. And as much detail as you want to add just will enhance the finished product. I'm just going to use a drill, a 3/8 drill, and I'm going to partially drill a hole through the head in order to create the illusion of an eye. I'm only going halfway through, and that's actually going to be one of the screw holes that I use to mount this to a wall or to a fence. I then went back to that Dremel grinder, same cutoff wheel, and I'm just making that mouth a little bit more cut groove to it or character to it. And then one of the final steps is I added some texture onto the turtle's head. And I did this just with a round burring tool. I put it in my drill. And you're just making little plunges, little texture. The final step, or one of the final steps, was going to be to stain the entire wooden sea turtle. I did it with a very dark walnut colored stain, and then I of course wiped it off the excess and let it dry completely, and then I went over it with some clear glossy lacquer. This is the finished product. A very simple, easy to make sea turtle, either fence or wall hanging sculpture. made out of 2x12 pressure treated wood. You certainly don't have to use pressure treated, it's just kind of what I had. But you can make it out of any wood that you have available, and you can make this in any size, for the wood that you have available. I hope you enjoyed this particular video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Please check us out on the web at DIYEasyCrafts.com. Thank you.